History of the Americas began in 1492 with the coming of Columbus. But that's not really the case. There's a whole other history which we are now just beginning to understand. It's the story of ancient America. Hello, I'm Wes Studi. As a Cherokee and an actor, I've had the opportunity to play great Indian leaders in motion pictures like Geronimo and Dances with Wolves. But now, I'd like to bring you on a journey with me to a time long ago when there were no borders between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The borders were different then, but every bit as real. Of all the Indian peoples north of Mexico, the wealthiest, and in some ways the most successful, were those who lived along the Pacific Northwest coast, the people of the rainforest and the rivers. The people of the Northwest coast, who were they? How did they live? What prehistoric events shaped their lives? It's a story told by archaeologists and other scientists, and equally important, it's told by my people, the Indian people. So join me as we travel across the continent and back in time on an exploration of ancient America, the Northwest.
Before Canada was even a thought, before the United States became a nation, there were nations here. Before the coming of the first European explorers, there was civilization here. Even before the retreat of the last ice age, man was here. Beneath the lava flows of Northern California, there are secrets. Here, things have remained as they were for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. The dank corridors of Fern Cave are unchanged. The cave walls are covered with symbols. The pictographs, or rock writings, were first discovered and photographed in the early part of the 1900s. They are among the best preserved records of rock writing in North America. Often, the rock writings are the only obvious indication of the people who were here before us. But what do they tell us? It's difficult to say. Researchers believe this pictograph documents the eruption of the Crab Nebula. Its date, July 5th, in the year 1054 AD. It's rare that we can use the cosmos as a calendar to date when man was here. We have no way to judge the age of most pictographs, and for the most part, their meanings are hidden. There is simply no way we can look into the mind of ancient man. Some of the images painted and carved in stone were art. but undoubtedly others were rock writings that told a story or left a message. History, by definition, is a written record of the past. Part of the problem may just be in our ability to read that record. In Central America, the Mayans recorded their histories on parchment tablets placed in libraries, and they chiseled hieroglyphics into the magnificent stone temples. Yet by the arrival of the first Europeans, their civilization had waned. Dense jungle covered the remains of Mayan civilization. Their cities of stone crumbled under the weight of neglect. But far to the north, along the shorelines of the Pacific Northwest coast, other advanced Indian societies were emerging. Like the Mayan, they too would leave their mark. The peoples of the North Pacific coast lived on the ragged edge of the continent. Far from being an isolated corner of North America, the Northwest coast was actually a cultural crossroads with trade networks which extended for hundreds and even thousands of miles. The coastal areas were spawning unique, highly developed cultures. For 1,500 miles up and down the coast, the Indian peoples shared for the most part a similar environment. The towering trees of the ancient forests. They lived in a land of giants, and they shared something else. Whereas other Native American cultures were based on agriculture or hunting and gathering, the Northwest coastal peoples were fishermen. Their fishing heritage is seen in their art. Occasionally, they would carve in stone, but most Northwest people worked in wood. Though much has vanished through time, enough of their wooden art has survived to give us an idea of their unique, highly stylized art legacy. The first explorers sailed into Northwest coastal waters in the late 1700s. They marveled at the plank houses, some 150 feet long, large even by European standards. Here they found a people who had roots, permanent villages that resembled, at least from a distance, the villages and small towns that the European and American explorers had left behind. Finally, in their voyages of discovery, they had encountered a civilization. Yet it would not be long before diseases would break the fabric of these Indian societies. Whole villages would disintegrate. The massive frameworks of their longhouses would survive as lonely sentinels, but they too would fall, to be reclaimed by the forest. The peoples of the Northwest coast were rich in art and material possessions, but also in ceremony and ritual. Their complex cultures must have been developing over a very long period of time. But when did these people first come here? The most widely accepted scientific theory is that the ancestors of today's Indians crossed the Bering Sea land bridge sometime before the end of the last ice age, 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier. We simply don't know.
We must remember that archaeology does not have all the answers. Many of my people believe that we've been here all along and that this land is our place of origin. It's not that the archaeologists are wrong, but there are, after all, at least two sides to every story. In one respect, archaeologists and Indians are getting closer together. Over the years, the archaeological time clock has been pushed further and further back by new discoveries.
In the Pacific Northwest, Indians have lived along the coast for many thousands of years. But just how far back in time? It's difficult to tell. The shoreline changes each year with winter storms that batter the coast with gale-force winds. More obviously, the shoreline also changes with the ebb and flow of daily tides. And on a much grander scale, with the ebb and flow of oceans and ice ages. In the volatile Northwest, the struggle between ocean and land has been ceaseless, and the shoreline has moved in each direction. If we want to look for early evidence of man on the coast, we would have to look underwater. Why? Because as the Ice Age glaciers receded, the ocean began to rise, and now the shorelines of ancient America are far out to sea. If people came to the Northwest coast 20,000 years ago, they would have come to an environment that is in some ways the same, but in many ways quite different than that of today. At present, it's a damp world of ferns and moss. But 20,000 years ago, North America was locked in an age of ice. The dense coastal forests, which have come to typify the Northwest, simply didn't exist. Instead, in their place was a vast open parkland with scattered trees and brushy undergrowth, much like that of the Canadian subarctic, almost 1,000 miles northward. The animals were also more suited to a climate with longer winters and shorter summers. Almost half of the Pacific Northwest region was covered by Ice Age glaciers. They began to recede around 13,000 years ago. But ice was to snuff out any record of man before that time. From ice to fire. The Northwest is a particularly volatile region, but sometimes this helps archaeologists. Obsidian, volcanic glass. In the same way that everyone's fingerprints are slightly different, every obsidian flow has a slightly different chemical makeup. It's known as a nuclear fingerprint, and it is this nuclear fingerprint that allows archaeologists to trace prehistoric trade.
We know that man was here even as Ice Age glaciers were receding. Because of the telltale fingerprints of obsidian, archaeologists are certain that very early on, Northwest Indian peoples had established trade networks which extended for hundreds, even thousands of miles. Yet there is so much that archaeology cannot tell us about ancient America and the peoples of the Northwest coast.
There is no time machine that can take us into the past. Early motion pictures have preserved only a small part of it. Archaeology is a tool which allows us to look at the past, but it too can only give us incomplete glimpses. It is difficult, if not impossible, to piece together the elements of the rich, unique cultures of the Pacific Northwest. Archaeology is not capable of deciphering the many important aspects of culture that distinguish one people from another. Their clothes, their handicrafts, their dances, their beliefs, and certainly their language. To all this, archaeology is deaf and, for the most part, blind. If the people were to disappear, to move on and leave all their belongings behind, only then can we see the real limitations of science. Clothes and basketry would quickly be destroyed by the elements. Their elaborate artwork, finely crafted boxes, ceremonial masks, and rattles would be lost. In most cases, anything wooden would succumb to weathering. In the passage of years, the only record an archaeologist might come across as he sifts through the accumulated sands of time are an occasional stone tool or implement, whose purpose he can only guess. Was this a simple stone bowl, or did it have a deeper ceremonial use? There is really no way to tell. The huge wooden totem poles and the timbers of the plank houses themselves would, within a very few years, be reclaimed by the forest. The archaeologist can never know the complete details of the elaborate culture that may have thrived here hundreds or thousands of years ago. Archaeology alone cannot tell us these things. We have to rely on accounts from early explorers and the Indians themselves. Only the Indians can tell us the meaning of the masks. There is another way, a completely different way to look at the past. And that is by listening to the people. Some legends tell of violent earthquakes, and confirming this, we find entire sunken forests in watery tombs. Earthquakes, storms, and natural disasters have left their mark not only on the landscape, but in the minds and the legends and lore of Northwest Indians. Mountains were gods. Washington's Mount Rainier blasted over 2,000 feet from its summit 5,600 years ago. The stories of floods and eruptions have been captured in the legends of the people who witnessed them. Today, the mountain rests uneasily. Its mile-wide crater is still steaming. Its ice hides the heat and the power below.
Some mountains were sacred places, and Mount Rainier was among the most sacred of all. It was a destination for the holy men, the shamans, the witch doctors. It was also a destination for young men on vision quests, seeking enlightenment. It was a place to test themselves and find their guardian spirit. These journeys to sacred mountains and other sacred places are traditions shared by many Indian people, and these traditions are still practiced today.
Animals such as the raven, bear, and eagle were deities and became symbols for clans. Almost universally, some mountains were sacred. The Salish-speaking Indians who lived in the lowlands called the mountain Tahoma, the high place with snow. The legends hold lessons for those who listen. Tahoma, or Mount Rainier, is massive. It is the largest single mountain in the lower 48 states. But 5,600 years ago, it was much, much larger. May 18th, 1980. Like Rainier before it, Mount St. Helens blew its top. Instantly, the landscape was changed. An earthquake triggered the collapse. Pent-up gases helped to blast out the north side of the mountain, and a superheated 200-mile-per-hour wind of volcanic ash scorched forests down to stumps. Spirit Lake was choked by downed timber and enlarged to almost twice its original size by a debris flow that blocked its outlet. And throughout it all, few of the scientists studying the eruption even bothered to ask a simple question. How did Spirit Lake get its name? What could the Indian people tell us about its past? As it turns out, Spirit Lake is an English translation of a Salish word, and its origin goes far back into time. The lake was a dangerous place to some Cowlitz Indians. It was haunted by evil spirits of destruction. The legends had served a real purpose. For generations, Indians had observed the mountain they called Luit, and their oral histories, their legends, told of its past eruptions. Again, in 1980, they saw Luit blow itself apart, reinforcing the legends that have told of the dangers of that forbidden place, Spirit Lake. Deep in the past, Indian legends tell of another eruption on another mountain, an eruption with far greater consequences than that of St. Helens. Mount Mazama. 15,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, Mazama was an active volcano. It was a beacon of fire in an age of ice. Finally, the Ice Age ended and the glaciers receded. The climate was moderating, but not the mountain. 6,700 years ago, after perhaps 3 years of violent eruptions, Mazama blew itself to pieces and blew pieces of itself around the world. When the ash and steam clouds cleared, all that remained was an immense crater, a hollow reminder of a cataclysmic eruption. Today, the crater is partially filled with water. The high rim of the caldera drops steeply towards 2,000-foot-deep Crater Lake. The passage of time has erased many of the scars. Yet the eruption is remembered, and Crater Lake is the centerpiece of many legends among Indian tribes of southern Oregon. But what is truly fascinating is that some of the legends are apparently based in fact. They are accounts, oral histories, of what geologists suspect actually happened 6,700 years ago. It was amazing that anyone close to Mazama could have survived. Yet the Klamath Indians did survive.
Hunt deer. They go clear down in there. That is even hunt deer. They have to climb down. They're pretty steep here.
Reed David is an elder and a chief and speaks of the legends about Crater Lake. He is one of the last of his tribe to speak their native language. In the twilight world of legends, fact and myth are often intertwined. Elements of the Klamath legends and those from other tribes are much too close to geological fact to be easily dismissed. In fact, they are oral histories that have been handed down from generation to generation.
Years ago, Crater Lake is known as Gawas in my language. Gawas means a steep cliff goes clear down towards the pretty blue lake. It's a purple.
The formation of Gawas, Crater Lake, is the story of Mount Mazama. Mazama was a massive volcano several times the size of St. Helens when it destroyed itself. The legend is a history, an oral history that predates almost all of the written histories of the world. The classic civilizations of Rome, Greece, and Egypt had climaxed and decayed. Histories have been written and lost, but the Klamaths still tell their legends. Indians were also keen observers of the environment. They lived close to the land. Long before geologists explained the eruptions in scientific terms, Indians knew what happened and how it happened.
The wind must be blown from the west towards the east. So it all went towards the east, towards Mars. The wind must have been blown that time years ago, left a lot of pumice and desert. There were no trees there. You can find it even now. That's been burned up many years ago. That way before my time, way before my great-great-grandfather's time even. So that's where it happened.
The winds blew the ash to the north and to the east, and eventually around the world. The Klamath living just south of the mountain were spared. Others were not so lucky.
Many would perish in the explosion and the ashfall that followed. The eruption also cast a dark cloud of hunger over many Indian cultures. For years to come, it threatened the very source of their existence, salmon. Most Northwest Indians, whether coastal or interior tribes, depended on salmon for a significant part of their diet.
On the Columbia River, Indians were fishing as far back as 8,000 years ago. The same river networks that helped trade develop between different peoples of the Northwest also provided a vital link in the food supply. Yet the rivers and the salmon were also a fragile link. Salmon spawn in the pure, unsilted waters of Northwest streams. Some evidence suggests that Mount Mazama almost destroyed the salmon runs, clogging waterways with millions of tons of volcanic ash, literally choking the salmon to death. It signaled difficult times for those who depended on salmon for life. Today, treaties guarantee Indians access to their accustomed fishing grounds. In the past, fibers from cedar bark or nettle plants were woven together to catch fish. From this use came the English word net. Traditional net fishing is still practiced among many tribes. Salmon has been such an important part of Northwest Indian life, it is difficult to imagine that for many years, Indians were forced by the Mazama eruption to look elsewhere for survival. Mount Mazama was a devastating landmark in time, its effects easily seen in the archaeological record. It destroyed the salmon runs and pushed many Northwest Coast Indian peoples to the brink of survival. It altered the lives of the peoples who lived here as much as it altered the landscape.
These oral histories are a living record of the past, older than the oldest written histories of Greece, Egypt, or China. They are as much of a treasure as the Dead Sea Scrolls or artifacts from King Tut's tomb. Chief Reed David tells of more than just Klamath Indian myths and legends. His words tell stories of a landmark in time. These are oral histories that help us read the unwritten story of ancient America in the Northwest.
Legends have traveled through time, and the art of the Northwest Coast people has traveled great distances. Small bone figurines, almost exactly alike, were found at various sites in British Columbia and in the Puget Sound area of Washington. They were traded over distances of hundreds of miles. Though worn and weather-beaten, they still show signs of intricate craftsmanship and attention to detail, such as the pierced ear. Similarities in Northwest Coast art indicate widespread contact and exchange of ideas as well as trade goods. The sheltered waterways of the coastal region from Washington to Alaska were actually highways of prehistoric commerce. Massive, sea-going canoes were the heartbeat of elaborate, wealthy civilizations. They were, in their own right, works of art. The canoes were highly valued. These quadrupedal war canoes were filmed in the early 1900s by pioneer movie maker Edward Curtis. Some canoes were up to 50 feet long and could carry 60 paddlers. The fierce Haida of the Queen Charlotte Islands used their seagoing war canoes to raid Tlingit and Tsimshian villages on the mainland, and even to venture 600 miles south to Washington's Puget Sound to raid villages of the Coast Salish. The Haida became expert canoe makers as well, making their canoes from single cedar logs. Steaming the hollowed logs allowed them to spread the sides and make canoes with broader beams. The tradition of the sleek, fast war canoes has not been lost. It is alive today and is an important part of powwows and festivities along the Northwest Coast. In ancient America, the competition was more serious. Speed in warfare may have meant the difference between surprising your adversaries and ambush, the difference between success and failure, between life and death. Traditional rivalries continued into the latter part of the 1800s. Screened by fog and armed with a flintlock trade musket, a Tlingit Raven warrior prepares for battle. The giant western red cedar of the coastal rainforest was valued not only for canoes. Its bark was woven into mats and clothing. Among the most prized possessions of all were the Tlingit's Chilkat blankets, which combined cedar bark fiber and mountain goat wool. Cedar bark and spruce root became ornate baskets. Some villages were famous for their expert craftsmanship and distinct design. No peoples of the Northwest Coast used pottery, but often spruce root and cedar fiber baskets were so finely woven they held water. Cedar from the seemingly endless forests was the most useful of woods. From it came not only canoes, but the elaborate rattles, the bentwood boxes, and the masks used in ceremonies. This is an ornate raven mask.
Masks were symbols, and most often used in rituals. But above all, it is the totem pole that has become the symbol for the people of the Northwest Coast. Tlingit, Tsimshian, Haida, Bella Bella, Bella Kula, Kwaikuru, Nootka, and the Coast Salish.
The first European explorers were awestruck. They were impressed with the intricate carvings and the supernatural designs of the totem poles. That, of course, was the idea. The totems told stories. They were writings in wood. The totems originated as carved posts in the walls of the huge plank houses. They were clan symbols and often indicated wealth and social rank in a village. Later they would become memorials to the dead, wooden tombstones. In the land of the Haida, impressive totems of cedar faced the sea, lining main streets of the villages such as Skidegate, Skadance, Masset, and Ninstins. Though weather-beaten and eroded by time, some of the ancient totems of a bygone era still remain to be found at the village site of Ninstance on Moseley Island in the Queen Charlotte's. But it's wrong to assume that the story of the totem has ended. It has not. In the storm-lashed land of the North, the Haida guard their heritage as fiercely today as in the past. Now the Haida are in the midst of a cultural renaissance, and totem carving is a part of it. Several Haida artists have led the way by returning to the past. Among them, two brothers, Robert and Reggie Davidson.
In the olden days, when they got their name, they were supposed to raise a totem pole. So that's, my dad asked me if I'd carve it for him because he's getting chief's name. He told me when I started, if I didn't finish it for the potlatch, it didn't matter because there's just going to be myself working on it, and it allowed me 2.5 months to work on it. So I said, sure, I'll do it.
This is a very special occasion. It's the first totem raised, the first naming of a chief, and the first potlatch in over 100 years.
I feel it's important. I mean, it shows that, like, when you're raising, when you get named, that's what you're supposed to do. I mean, and I felt it was really important that I wanted to finish it for my dad. So I mean, if there's squabble over him getting the name or whatever name they're going to give him, the person that's squabbling it also, if they want to take the name away, they'd have to give her a bigger potlatch and maybe raise a bigger pole or something. It's good that there'll be another totem pole raised in the village, but maybe it'll inspire other people to do some, like the other chiefs, to raise a totem pole in front of their house. Like maybe it might start something new here.
A potlatch by tradition is a feast where a family or individual confirms high status by giving gifts, by giving away wealth. For hundreds and possibly thousands of years, potlatches and weddings brought Northwest Coast peoples together. Haida artist Robert Davidson.
But the more I discover the depth of our culture, the more I get excited and want to keep feeding into it. Ceremony marks the change in direction, and we have to take time. We have to take time to mark that change. We have to, through potlatches, feasts, and the more that happens, the more people become educated with that philosophy, and the more people are exposed to it, the more knowledge that they gain, and the more they want to be part of it. You can't create without knowledge. And so, like a potlatch is actually a creation. You create the forum, and that forum is to make a statement. And that statement defines who you are and where you're coming from, and it's equivalent to the Supreme Court.
Very seldom that this kind of occasion is bestowed on anybody. And tonight, it has been bestowed upon me, but there is one time that I personally feel that I'm going to be responsible for more of my people.
These coastal societies were among the wealthiest of all in ancient America. Indians mined metal too. Especially valuable were the coppers, clan symbols, sometimes 3 feet high, made of flat pounded copper. Wealth was acquired because getting enough food to survive was never really a problem. The sea and the streams, the forest and the meadows, and even the sky provided all they could want. Women held great power and were sometimes chiefs or shamans. Most were matrilineal societies, and wealth was passed down on the mother's side. They were especially rich in art, ceremony, song, dance, and traditions. The legends were not only told, but acted out and brought to life. In this way, the legends would not be forgotten, but handed down generation to generation, virtually unchanged. The spirit of the potlatch lives today, in spite of the fact that the potlatch had been banned in the late 1800s by the Canadian government. From the early 1800s and the arrival of trade goods from Europe and America, potlatches evolved into very elaborate trades of wealth. Traditions like totems and the potlatch tell us something about ancient America, about the diverse peoples who were here before the first contact with Europeans. The Indian peoples can tell us things which archaeologists and other sciences cannot. But science is making some remarkable discoveries. And now it is known that the Europeans may not have been the first to reach these shores and make contact with Northwest Indians. One of the most amazing finds in Northwest archaeology has recently unfolded near the mouth of an Oregon river. Dr. John Woodward is an archaeologist working at the site on the northern Oregon coast. He is here for a very special reason.
We found that one reason for conducting archaeological research in this area is the presence of 17th century Chinese ceramics on the Indian house pit floors.
The ceramics were originally cargo aboard Asian junks, or possibly even European ships. Straying off course, the ships were captured by currents and blown by storms across 5,000 miles of the North Pacific, finally to be shipwrecked on the shores of this distant, unfamiliar continent.
There are many documented cases of Japanese watercraft being washed ashore on the west coast of North America. The Indians retrieved items from these wrecks, including Chinese ceramics, which often were carried by the Japanese boats in the Asian trade of that time. The Chinese ceramics were often fashioned into small tools, including arrow points, scrapers, and other items. The Indian people were really quite creative. When they found these bits of porcelain, they very often pressure flaked them into tools, including arrow points, probably long before the contact with European cultures.
The Asian trade was well developed by the 1400s. The search continues for evidence that Orientals may have set foot on North America even before Columbus, before 1492. If so, this Chinese connection may force historians to rethink and possibly to rewrite a page of the history of ancient America. The rugged northwest coast may not have been a welcome landfall for the seafarers. Historically, records show that in the early 1800s, the macaws captured and enslaved Japanese sailors. The North Pacific coast abounds in archaeological sites, but one stands out from the rest. It is the macaw village known as Ozette, near the northwest tip of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. In many ways, it is probably one of the richest archaeological sites ever discovered in North America. Dr. Richard Doherty of Washington State University headed the dig. One stormy winter evening about 400 years ago, a mudslide bulldozed a path through Ozette. Sleeping villagers, houses, and their contents were smothered by a thick clay ooze. The clay stopped time, preserving a day in the life of the village.
The perishable nature of the artifacts buried within the houses, shovels and trowels won't work. They would simply damage the very delicate objects. So we've developed techniques of using water. We know that the story of Ozette is not yet finished. Even though 5 houses have been excavated, we know that below a still earlier mud flow lies an earlier Ozette village.
The mud flow was a disaster for the village, but later it would be a gold mine for archaeologists.
Because of the unique conditions of preservation and because of the richness of the materials found preserved here in the ground, Ozette is probably one of the most significant archaeological sites found anywhere.
The Ozette area has changed little. It is still a roadless wilderness. After the dig had closed, the macaws held a ceremony to dedicate the site to their ancestors who died in the mudflow 400 years before. Tribal elders thanked the archaeologists for their hard work.
It looked like to me it was a hardship, but the joy in their heart as they'd done it made me feel real good.
Nearby at the Hoko River Archaeological Project, archaeologists have discovered baskets and items from fishing camps that date back to 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. This cedar tooth comb was last used 2,000 years ago. Right into this century, the macaws at Ozette and all coastal tribes took advantage of the riches coastal life provided. The people of Ozette and the Nootkas of Canada's Vancouver Island challenged the North Pacific for the biggest prize of all. They were whalers, and they had been doing this for 2,000 years or longer. Yet among coastal tribes, one magnificent animal is at the heart of many legends: the killer whale. The killer whale occupies that special niche between legend and reality. From Alaska to Washington, coast peoples respected and revered this marine mammal. Lewis and Clark's journey across the continent in 1805 was to mark the beginning of the end. The expedition blazed the trail for many to follow. Ironically, the explorers were aided by Indians along their way. They lived off of Indian foods and smoked the Indian tobacco, kinnikinnick. The expedition was the turning point. History was in the making, a history that was spurred on by the demand for beaver pelts and the burgeoning fur trade. But in the Northwest, history actually began and prehistory ended with the first voyages of discovery 3 decades earlier. The historic moments between the meetings of cultures were recorded by shipboard artists and in the ship's logs. However, among the images carved in stone which crowd the coastal rocks are other, more familiar signs. The ship's captains weren't the only ones recording the events.
Northwest Coast people have shown all of us a unique artistic heritage, unlike any other. Oral histories help us see ancient America in a different way. And they may be among the oldest known histories in the world. And they're not from Europe, from China, Egypt, or the Middle East. They're all American stories, our own. They tell us who we are and where we come from. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these Northwest Coast people is to be found in their feelings toward the land. Like most Indian societies, they lived in close, intimate contact with their surroundings.
In 1854, the leader of the Duwamish people, Chief Sielt, spoke before white settlers, who just a few years earlier had founded a new town. The settlement, named after the chief, would eventually grow into the gleaming glass and steel metropolis of Seattle, Washington.
Chief Sielt's message was recalled years later by physician Dr. Henry Smith. Among scholars, there is controversy surrounding the great chief's speech, and it is somewhat doubtful that these are his actual words. Yet among Native Americans, there is much that rings true. If not precisely the words of Chief Seattle, the words do capture the spirit, the essence of his concerns for both the environment and his people, the Indian people.
Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. The shining water that moves in the streams and rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. Each ghostly reflection in the clear water of the lakes tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is the voice of my father's father. The rivers are our brothers. They quench our thirst. They carry our canoes and feed our children. So you must give to the rivers the kindness you would give to any brother. Remember that the air is precious to us, that the air shares the spirit of all the life that it supports. The wind that gave our grandfather his first breath also receives his last sigh. Will you teach your children what we have taught our children? That the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls all the sons of the earth. This we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. Tribe follows tribe, and nation follows nation. Like the waves of the sea, it is the order of nature, and regret is useless. And when the last red man shall have perished, and the memory of my tribe shall have become a myth among the white men, these shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. Tonight, when the streets of your cities and villages are silent, and you think them deserted, they will throng with the returning hosts that once filled and still love this beautiful land. The white man will never be alone.
In 1854, Chief Seattle saw the world through the eyes of a concerned leader, through the eyes of an Indian. He was an environmentalist before the word existed. His prophecies and his fears have new meaning now. But he was wrong about one thing. His people, the Indian people, are still here. As individuals and as nations within nations, we have survived. And the story of ancient America lives on with us.
Today we can look into the mind of ancient man. Some of the images painted and carved in stone were art, but undoubtedly others were rock writings that told a story or left a message. History, by definition, is a written record of the past. Part of the problem may just be in our ability to read that record. In Central America, the Mayans recorded their histories on parchment tablets placed in libraries, and they chiseled hieroglyphics into the magnificent stone temples. Yet by the arrival of the first Europeans, their civilization had waned. Dense jungle covered the remains of Mayan civilization. Their cities of stone crumbled under the weight of neglect. But far to the north, along the shorelines of the Pacific Northwest coast, other advanced Indian societies were emerging. Like the Mayan, they too would leave their mark. The peoples of the North Pacific coast lived on the ragged edge of the continent. Far from being an isolated corner of North America, the Northwest coast was actually a cultural crossroads with trade networks which extended for hundreds.
Of all the Indian peoples north of Mexico, the wealthiest, and in some ways the most successful, were those who lived along the Pacific Northwest coast, the people of the rainforest and the rivers. The people of the Northwest coast, who were they? How did they live? What prehistoric events shaped their lives? It's a story told by archaeologists and other scientists, and equally important, it's told by my people, the Indian people. So join me as we travel across the continent and back in time on an exploration of ancient America, the Northwest.
Before Canada was even a thought, before the United States became a nation, there were nations here. Before the coming of the first European explorers, there was civilization here. Even before the retreat of the last ice age, man was here. Beneath the lava flows of Northern California, there are secrets. Here, things have remained as they were for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. The dank corridors of Fern Cave are unchanged. The cave walls are covered with symbols. The pictographs, or rock writings, were first discovered and photographed in the early part of the 1900s. They are among the best preserved records of rock writing in North America. Often, the rock writings are the only obvious indication of the people who were here before us. But what do they tell us? It's difficult to say. Researchers believe this pictograph documents the eruption of the Crab Nebula. Its date, July 5th in the year 1054 AD. It's rare that we can use the cosmos as a calendar to date when man was here. We have no way to judge the age of most pictographs, and for the most part their meanings are hidden. There is simply no way.
The history of the Americas began in 1492 with the coming of Columbus. But that's not really the case. there's a whole other history which we are now just beginning to understand. It's the story of ancient America. Hello, I'm Wes Studi. As a Cherokee and an actor, I've had the opportunity to play great Indian leaders in motion pictures like Geronimo and Dances with Wolves. But now, I'd like to bring you on a journey with me to a time long ago when there were no borders between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The borders were different then, but every bit as
hundreds and even thousands of miles. The coastal areas were spawning unique, highly developed cultures. For 1,500 miles up and down the coast, the Indian peoples shared for the most part a similar environment. The towering trees of the ancient forests. They lived in a land of giants, and they shared something else. Whereas other Native American cultures were based on agriculture or hunting and gathering, the Northwest coastal peoples were fishermen. Their fishing heritage is seen in their art. Occasionally, they would carve in stone, but most Northwest people worked in wood. Though much has vanished through time, enough of their wooden art has survived to give us an idea of their unique, highly stylized art legacy. The first explorers sailed into Northwest coastal waters in the late 1700s. They marveled at the plank houses, some 150 feet long, large even by European standards. Here they found a people who had roots, permanent villages that resembled, at least from a distance, the villages and small towns that the European and American explorers had left behind. Finally,